Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1, Falls of Montmorency. In our plate today, we present another rich view of American scenery, which makes the third of the series promised in the Rover a few weeks ago. The series will continue from time to time, as fast as good subjects well engraved can be procured. The Falls of Montmorency form one of the most remarkable and picturesque views of the kind, not only in this country, but probably the wide earth over. Remarkable not for the great body of water, but the perpendicular height and the wildness of the surrounding scenery. About 9 miles from Quebec, where the majestic St. Lawrence glides quietly along its rugged banks, a graceful tributary daughter from the far-off wilderness comes winding its way through the forest and plain like a bright creature instinct with life, seeking to embrace a kindred spirit. She comes to the very verge of the Mother of Waters. She can hail her from the hilltops, but a high and rude barrier suddenly stops her progress. Stays that bright creature long in her bondage? It cannot be. A river, like love, will find out its way, and she, the beautiful stream, that has been so gentle and quiet, with magic power, cuts her way through the rough mountain pass and leaps joyfully down the precipice 240 feet and rests on the quiet bosom of the kindred spirit below. Nor does the similitude of life here stop, for how naturally does the imagination follow them, and behold them mingling their fortunes and pursuing their course together till lost in the broad and boundless ocean. The following lines on the Falls of Lodore by Southey have such a happy adaptation to our present subject, and are, besides, so beautifully descriptive, that we think they cannot fail to be read with much interest. Through moss and through brake it runs and it creeps, for a while till it sleeps in its own little lake. And thence at departing, awakening and starting, it runs through the reeds, and away it proceeds, through meadow and glade, in sun and in shade, and through the wood shelter, among crags in its flurry, helter-skelter, hurry-scurry. Here it comes sparkling, and there it lies darkling, and smoking and frothing, its tumult and wrath in, till in its rapid race, on which it is bent, it reaches the place of its steep descent. The cataract strong then plunges along, striking and raging, as if a war waging, its caverns and rocks among. Rising and leaping, sinking and creeping, swelling and sweeping, showering and springing, flying and flinging, writhing and ringing, eddying and whisking, spouting and frisking, turning and twisting, around and around, with endless rebound, smiting and fighting, a sight to delight in, confounding, astounding, dizzying and deafening the ear with its sound. Collecting, projecting, receding and speeding, and shocking and rocking, and darting and parting, and threading and spreading, and whizzing and hissing, and dripping and skipping, and hitting and splitting, and shining and twining, and rattling and battling, and shaking and quaking, and pouring and roaring, and waving and raving, and tossing and crossing, and flowing and going, and running and stunning, and foaming and roaming, and dinning and spinning, and dropping and hopping, and working and jerking, and guggling and struggling, and heaving and cleaving, and glittering and frittering, and gathering and feathering, and whitening and brightening, and quivering and shivering, and hurrying and scurrying, and thundering and floundering, dividing and gliding and sliding, and falling and brawling and sprawling, and driving and riving and striving, and sprinkling and twinkling and wrinkling, and sounding and bounding and rounding, and bubbling and troubling and doubling, and grumbling and rumbling and tumbling, and clattering and battering and shattering. Retreating and beating and meeting and sheeting, delaying and staying and playing and straying, advancing and prancing and glancing and dancing, recoiling, turmoiling and toiling and boiling, and gleaming and streaming and steaming and beaming, and rushing and flushing and brushing and gushing, and flapping and rapping and clapping and slapping, and curling and whirling and purling and twirling, and thumping and plumping and bumping and jumping, and dashing and splashing and flashing and clashing, and so never ending, but always descending, sounds and motions for ever and ever are blending, all at once and all o'er with a mighty uproar, and this way the water comes down at the door. End of section 1, recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2, Life on the Gulf of Mexico by E.K. Sketches 1 and 2. Sketch 1, The Commission Merchant. "Mamma, give me a ribbon, give me a ribbon," exclaimed my black-eyed one as she bounded into the room. "Here comes Lorenzo with the patco. Give us all one to tie round its neck," was the request of the eldest of my little flock, "and let us write our names upon them. The ladies do so, and why should not we? Well, my dears, and where is Lorenzo?" "Here he is, mamma, and pray give us some handsome pieces of ribbon." Lorenzo, albeit as unsightly an object as could well be selected, was no unimportant character in the Spanish town of Pensacola. Imagine to yourself a Negro lad of 17 or 18, small in size but muscular, with a visage but 1 degree removed from absolute ugliness, protruding lips which, when he smiled, and this was almost continually, for it was part of his trade, rolled themselves back to their extreme limits, exhibiting an irregular row of ivories, one in front entirely wanting, lost probably in a fight. He was an eminent pugilist, added to his other accomplishments, eyes that enjoyed the same pastime as his lips, that of rolling about to the extreme of their orbits, but which, when engaged in his profession, displayed great intelligence. Lorenzo was an itinerant merchant, not a peddler, by any manner of means, but a regular commission merchant, Madam G. his principal. Within a day or two after an arrival from our southern metropolis, the most conspicuous object in town was Lorenzo, attired as to neither garments, as usual, that is to say, a pair of coarse linen or old cloth trousers, cotton shirt, suspenders or not, as it happened, barefoot but not, as on ordinary days, bareheaded. Nature had covered his cranium, not with wool, but knots, or burrs, resolutely determined to have their way, as well as lips and eyes, and therefore to be peculiar and perverse, instead of growing with his growth, had strengthened with his strength, and this was no trifle, into the aforesaid knots, Gordian knots, one might call them, for no human card nor comb would ever disentangle them. Well, upon these tufts rested a cushion of twisted straw, wrapped round with any old cloth that came handiest as he was about to start on his mercantile tour. And upon this shriek not, patronesses of Stewarts and Peytons, an old drawer or an old basket, whichever, as I before said, came handiest, filled, piled up, so high with goods that a covering was necessary, tucked in at the sides to prevent the upper tiers from falling off. Look at Lorenzo with this immense height on his head, untouched by his hands, however, for in one he flourishes a yardstick, no, not a yardstick either, but a French L measure, and in the other an apple, an orange, or perhaps holds it ready, doubled up to cuff the first urchin, black or white, who may venture to crack a joke at his top-heavy appearance. See now the contents of his basket displayed, not on a counter, but upon the bare cloth before mentioned, which he has spread upon the floor or carpet of the house just entered. Fine linens, splendid French embroideries, silk in the finest of thread stockings, silks, satins, laces, jewelry, rouge, pearl powder, pins, needles, and numberless other articles, all of the finest and best, occasionally a bandbox containing a perfect French hat. And now the bargain and sale. Before leaving home, his mistress has fixed her prices, which he never varies, for upon these he has his commission. Lorenzo knows well the taste of every lady in town, and their means of paying. He never credits. If he did, he would lose his percentage, but he rarely leaves a house without selling something. Day after day he traverses the streets, for he is never in a hurry, and gradually the pile of goods diminishes to be renewed upon every fresh arrival. This commission business is Lorenzo's profession, but like his brotherhood, he dips in other things. He is the mercury of the town. Many a note is exchanged, besides bank notes, and of course our hero pockets the postage like many of his brotherhood in this department again, for, take him all in all, Lorenzo is quite a man of the world, an accomplished man of the world. He is a regular member of the town band, performing either on the drum, violin, triangle, or tambourine, as occasion might offer. Upon these occasions a clean cotton shirt and trousers render his appearance rather more seemly. With a huge bunch of palmetto leaves attached to the end of a rope, rendered sufficiently heavy by having an old iron pot or fragment of stone bound firmly to it, our hero might be seen at odd times astride of a chimney, cleaning the different flues by dropping down this burden and hauling it up again, cheering himself meanwhile with a song or a word to the passers-by. Upon extraordinary occasions, like the one which ushered our hero to the acquaintance of our northern readers, Lorenzo was invariably called upon for the best of all reasons. He knew every individual in town, where the greatest abundance of ribbons were to be found, the sine qua non, upon the occasion to which we refer, the belles who would be most conspicuous, and those who were sure to be so, whether they would or not. All were expected to be contributors, for this was no bargain and sale affair, but the preparative to a scene of pleasure peculiar to the buoyant and blessed air and sunshine of the old Spanish town from which this sketch is drawn. Sketch 2. The Patgo. For years after the first settlement of our country, pastimes and festivals familiar to the emigrant in the land of his nativity were still continued in the land of his adoption. These time-honored pleasures are now entirely unknown in our northern and eastern states, and but a faint remnant can be found at the far south, preserved there probably from an inherent love of pleasure, our southern brethren preferring to gather roses on the pathway of life. The thorns thrust themselves into notice. One of these festivals we propose sketching for the amusement of our readers. The patgo itself is the figure of a bird carved out of a cypress knot, a wood of almost impenetrable hardness, selected on this very account, as will be seen hereafter. After being painted a dark color, the bird is fastened on the top of a pole 15 or 20 feet high. It is then entrusted to the care of someone well known in town, who goes from house to house, soliciting a ribbon from every lady to tie round its neck. The bird soon assumes a gay appearance, flaunting in all the colors of the rainbow. A day is next appointed for shooting the patgo, a spot selected, the pole fixed firmly in the ground, and the gorgeous bird on its extremity is for the time the cynosure of every eye. The town is nearly deserted. Every vehicle is put in requisition until the multitude gather at the appointed spot. The male part of the assembly draws lots, and according to their order take aim, and fire at our figurehead. Almost every shot brings down a ribbon. This is received with shouts of applause, and the lady whose name is written on it is the partner of the successful marksman for the first dance. Occasionally, upon a part of the bird falling, the band strikes up a joyous air. The firing is continued until the last remnant of the bird is brought down. A triumphant shout rings through the forest. A march is played by the village band, and the victor, seated in a chair, is borne in procession round the circle of ladies, in order that he may select one to share his honors. The victor and the lady of his choice are now declared king and queen of the patgo. The dance commences, and the sovereigns of the house lead the graceful measure. We will now imagine it the morning of the festival, with the dawn's first light. Bright eyes are watching for indications of a bright and glorious day, in this instance dreading no rivalry. The deeper the blushes of Aurora, the more joyously is she hailed by the happy heart waiting her appearance. From the grandmother to the infant at the breast, all are in a state of preparation. Gay dresses are donned, the neat slippers fitted to the foot, the mantilla gracefully arranged, and fan in hand the Spanish lady's toilette is complete. After an early breakfast, the vehicles make their appearance. Before one or two doors might be seen a barouche, a regular carriage our town could not boast. A stage coach perambulated slowly from door to door until its inmates veto further admission. But the majority of the ladies and children were conveyed to the Oaks, the sacred grove of the Patgo, in the 3 horse drays of the country. This mode of harnessing 3 horses to a dray is another peculiarity of Pensacola. The odd fellow is hitched to one side, we presume for the purpose of encouraging his partners to pull. To all intents and purposes, he is the silent partner of the concern, for work he does not. After sweeping out these carts, a crumb cloth or a quilt is spread, and the female portion of the community seat themselves. The males are expected to go on foot or ride double, as it happens. Long before the multitude assemble, the preparations at the Oaks have been completed. Tables spread, fires kindled at convenient spots for cooking, wines and liquors immersed in tubs of cold spring water, the cooks with clean aprons and sleeves rolled up to the shoulder, making demonstration of what is to follow. Mine host of the Pensacola Hotel, superintending all things, and at these things he is au fait, for he is a Creole, and pride spurs him on to action. Would our limits permit, almost every individual in this sketch could be filled out into a character. As it is, we will but touch lightly. It is the 4th of July, and the thunder of cannon from the ships of war in port announce the anniversary of a nation's birth. Flags are flying from every masthead, and everything animate and inanimate seems beside itself with joy. Wend we on our way, drive ahead of those drays, the dust will suffocate us. Missus, I does beat the old mules, and won't go any faster. Ladies, pray dismount and take a seat in my carriage. You will avoid the dust and be at your journey's end in half the time. Here we are. How delightful the shade beneath these live oaks, and how gay the scene. The firing has already commenced, and by the shouts and music a large knot of ribbons must have fallen. Pistol, gun, and rifle are fired in quick succession. This ribbon binds you to be my partner for the first dance, fair lady, said a son of the ocean to a dark-eyed Creole, who, nothing loath, assisted in tying it in his buttonhole. And this makes you mine for a few brief moments, scornful Isidora, said another of Neptune's sons to the loveliest of that bevy of lovely ones. Unwillingly was the hand given, but the rules of the festival were peremptory. Anxiously is that striped blue and white ribbon watched by Miss Spry, the would-be young lady. Time had spiced her too highly with pepper and salt, for the iron gray would appear, in spite of the Indian dye lavishly poured over her locks. Maliciously floated the blue and white ribbon in the air, more coy than its owner. Not a shot would touch it. I'm wrong. It is down, and Aesculapius has won it. Horror and dismay are depicted on his countenance, for Miss Spry is his abomination. Courage, doctor, the dance will soon be over. With a diabolical grimace the hand is offered, and not accepted but seized, the hated ribbon tied into such a knot on his breast, and the doctor and Miss Spry are ready for the coming events. It is your turn now, Judge. A dignified and most benevolent-looking man steps forth, fires, and the last remnant of the patgo is at his feet. A triumphant march peals forth, and our friend, seated in a chair, is elevated on the shoulders of his courtiers for the time. A splendid bouquet is handed him to be presented to his queen-elect. Quickly is the circle formed, and 3 times round it is borne the victor. He alights, the fragrant offering is made, and amid smiles and blushes the queen of the revel is led to the dance. A temporary flooring has been laid, the canvas roof decked with garlands and flowers, completing the rustic appearance of the ballroom. Dinner is soon announced, and the revel is now at its height. Lavishly as the board is spread, the demands upon it are as great. Behind the ladies who are seated at the table officiate their attentive partners, and behind these again are dodging about the sable nurses of the younger children. Well-filled plates are disappearing in the numerous tents scattered through the trees, and the laughter and merriment give demonstration of the satisfaction reigning within. The day wanes. Matrons take their departure. The light-hearted and happy still trip it on light, fantastic toe. But with the setting sun a farewell is sighed to the brave old oaks left towering aloft in the gathering twilight. Why steal these feeling of disquietude over us? Is it that fast coming events cast their shadows before? Is it that the King of Terrors has stretched his arm over us, and that although invisible his presence is felt? In 1 month what gloom and desolation has darkened our firmament! On a bright and glorious Sabbath morning, a short space after the festival of the Patgo, the mail from Charleston arrived. Letters are open, but why this horror and dismay? The good, the excellent, the beloved of all hearts, although comparatively a stranger among us, is no more. He whom so lately we beheld in the midst of his mimic court, crowned with the love and respect of every individual of the community, is now before the tribunal of the King of Kings. The steamer Pulaski is lost, and Judge R. is drowned, was the announcement that for many a day saddened the hearts and checked the hopes of the inhabitants of Pensacola. End of section 2.
Section 3 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. The Irish Reaper, from Tales of the Borders, by James Mackay Wilson. Some years ago, I was proceeding from Roncombe to Manchester in one of the passage boats which ply upon the Duke of Bridgewater's canal. There could not be less than 100 passengers, and they were of as motley a description as the imagination of man could conceive, even in a dream. The boats exactly resemble a long, low, flat-roofed wooden house, but sufficiently lofty for a middle-sized person to stand erect between the floor and the roof, or rather the deck. At one end sat about a dozen primitive Methodists, alternately reading passages of Scripture or bursting forth, at the extreme pitch of their voice, into a squall of music, singing hymn upon hymn, until my very ears ached, and the timbers of the boat might have started. Near them sat a number of young, rosy-cheeked Welsh women, staring at the vocalists with a look of wondering vacancy that the goats on their own mountains could not have surpassed. There were also manufacturers' wives and children, returning from a 7 days' visit to Runcorn for the benefit of a salt-water dip in the Mersey, and 6 or 8 prim, sober, sleek, silent, well-dressed Quakers, with a more than sprinkling of the boys of the Emerald Isle. The loud laugh of one of them was ever and anon heard above the shrill music of the ranters. He was about 5 feet 7 inches high, and exceedingly strong and well made. He wore an old greatcoat of a yellowish blanket color, and a hat, the crown of which had fallen in with service, and its brim was equally turned up before and behind, and on both sides. His feet were thrust into a pair of brogues of true Irish manufacture, which, with a pair of coarse blue worsted stockings and corduroy inexpressibles, completed his outward man. He carried an apparently empty sack under his arm, and was surrounded by about a dozen of his countrymen, who seemed to regard him as an oracle, heartily echoing back his boisterous laughter, and exclaiming, "Well done, Mr. McCarthy! Faith, and it's you that's your mother's own son, at any rate." O'Connell had sailed from Liverpool on the previous day, and his countrymen were discussing his political merits. "Why, bad luck to ye!" exclaimed our hero with the grey-coat, in answer to one who had held forth in praise of the counsellor. "And is it you, McMahon, that says every man in Ireland should pay the O'Connell rent? But I'll tell ye a bit of a parable, as Father O'Shea says, and a parable too of my own natural mother's making. 'Larry,' says she to me, 'Larry McCarthy, don't be after planting those big potatoes for seed, for they've a hole in their heart a little Christian might slape in.'" "You're no better than a Seasnack, Larry," interrupted the aforesaid Mick. "Can't ye spake your manning like a man, if you have any manning at all, at all?" There was like to have ended in an Irish row in reality, though the majority evidently sided with Mr. Larry McCarthy, not because they agreed with him in opinion, but because, as afterward appeared, he was their master or employer. The disputants paused for a moment, and a loud groan, as if from one in great bodily pain, mingled with the wailings of a woman, was heard from the farther corner of the boat. Larry turned round, to use his own expression, like a flash of lightning, and the next moment he stood by the side of the sufferer, who was a tall, bony-looking figure. But, save the skin that covered them, there was little of his mortal man but the bones left. It was only necessary to look on his features, wasted as they were, to tell that he too was an Irishman. A young wife sat beside him, whose countenance resembled beauty personifying sorrow. She had a child at her breast, and two others, the eldest not more than 5 years of age, stood by her knee. Larry looked upon the group, and his heart was touched. "Och, and what may be ailing ye, countrymen?" said he. "Sure and ye wouldn't be after dying among friends, would ye?" "Oh, hon, is it a friend that would be asking after my own Patrick?" replied the poor wife. "Sure then, and he is ill, and we're all ill together. It is 6 blessed months since he earned a breadth of tenpenny. Oh, blackness on the day that the rheumatus came on him." "Sure now, and is that all?" interrupted Larry. "And belike the doctors have been chatting you, for I tell you, honey, and you too, Patrick, those 'natomy chaps know no more about the rheumatus than holy Solomon knew about steamboats. But belike I'm the man that doesn't know neither, but maybe you're chatting yourself if you think so. I'll tell you what it is. The rheumatus is a wandering wind between the flesh and the bone, and more than that, there is no way to cure it but to squeeze it out at the ends of the fingers or toes." "Oh, my children's sorrow on it this," replied the suffering man's wife. "But more and above, the rheumatus Patrick got his leg broke last February." "Ah, splintered honey," added the husband. "And the doctors, bad luck be wid 'em, can't make nothing on't, and I am now going to the great Salford bone doctor." "And maybe he won't be curing that bit bone without the money," said Larry, with an expression of sympathy. The sufferer shook his head and was silent. His wife burst into tears. "I will work, I will beg, I will die for my Patrick," she exclaimed, and pressed the child closer to her breast. "Ye had better be bearing the dying, honey," returned Larry, "and it wouldn't a raffle think ye among friends be more genteel than begging among strangers." "Oh, hon, and is it friends, you say?" replied she. "Yes, sure, and it is friends that I say," answered Larry, "and a raffle is what no gintleman need be ashamed on." The boat at this moment stopped opposite an inn at the side of the canal. Larry borrowed a quart measure from the skipper and sprang ashore. In a few minutes he returned with a quantity of rum, and handing it first to the wife and then to her lame husband, said, "Come, warm up thy old bones at the drop of the oyster." He called the rest of his countrymen round him, and handed the liquor to each. When gathered together, there might be about 16 or 18 of them. "Ah, now, and these are all my men," said Mr. Larry McCarthy, with a look of comical consequence, to his infirm countryman. "And where would you be finding better? We are gone up a bit of work in Lancashire, for the English are no better than born childer at our work." And raising the liquor to his head, he added, "Here's the Holy Virgin be with us, countrymen, and better luck to your bed leg, and should it ever be mended at all, though you mayn't be good for much at hood work any more, you have still a stout bone for a barrow, and you won't be forgetting to ask for Larry McCarthy. And now, boys," continued he, turning to his workmen, "here is his poor man, and more than this, I'm saying, our own lawful countryman, with the rheumatis and a broken leg, and his wife, too, as you see, and those 3 little cherubims, all starving, to be sure, and he going to the doctor's without a penny. Sure you won't disguise old Ireland. Just look at the childer, and I say that a raffle is the genteel way of doing the thing." So saying, he thrust his hand into his pocket, and pulled out a small canvas bag, filled with silver, and tied round the mouth with a strong cord. He took off his indescribable brown hat, he threw in a piece or two of silver, and went round, shaking it among his countrymen. Each took out a similar bag to Larry's, and threw his mite into the hat. He then, without counting them, emptied its contents into the lap of the poor woman, and I should think, from their appearance, they must have amounted to 30 or 40 shillings. She burst into tears. The lame man grasped his hand and endeavoured to thank him. "Don't be after spaking," said Larry. "D'ye think we aren't Christians?" Such was the Irish raffle. Larry instantly resumed his jokes, his jests, and his arguments, but I could do nothing during the rest of the passage but think of the Good Samaritan and admire Mr. Larry McCarthy. In the September of 1834, I was wandering by the side of a country churchyard, situated near the banks of the Tyne. The sun had gone down, and the twilight was falling grey upon the graves. I saw a poor-looking man, whose garments fluttered in tatters with the evening breeze, and who, by his appearance, seemed to be an Irish reaper, rise from among the tombs. He repeatedly drew the sleeve of his coat across his eyes, and I could hear him sobbing heavily, as though his heart would burst. As we approached each other, I discovered that he was my old canal-boat companion, and then merry and kind-hearted Larry McCarthy, but no more like the Larry I had then seen him than a funeral to a bridal. His frame was wasted to a skeleton, and hunger and misery glistened in his eyes together. "Ha!" said I, accosting him, "is it possible that sorrow could have laid his heavy hand upon the light heart of Larry McCarthy?" "Sure," said he, drying away the tears that ran down his wan and want-worn cheeks, "it is true, and too true, and heavy is the hand, sure enough, but not so heavy as it should be, or it would be weighing me into that grave. But how do you know me, sir? And who told you my name, as I don't know yours, for sure? And mine is Larry McCarthy, as my father and mother and his reverence, wid my natural sponsors, to boot, all every one of them, say and affirm." I reminded him of the canal boat and the raffle, and inquired the cause of his distress, and his visit to the grave. "Ah, master," said he, "and you touch a sore place when you ask me to tell it. Perhaps you don't know, for how should you, that not long after the time you spake of in the canal boat, I came down to what ye call the borders here, to a bit of navigating work that was to be a long job. I lodged with a widow, a decent old woman, that had a daughter they called Mary, and, you may be thinking that ever Mary had an equal, but it's wrong that you are if you think so. Her eyes were like drops of dew upon the shamrock, and although she was not Irish, but Scotch, it was all one, for, you know, the Scotch and Irish are one man's childer. But at any rate, she had a true Irish heart, and but for the sea or the Channel, as they call it, she would have been Irish as well as me. The more I saw of Mary, I loved her the more. Better than a bird loves the green tree. She loved me, too. And we were married. The old woman died a few weeks before Mary presented me with 2 little Larrys. I might have called them both Larry, for they were as like each other as your 2 eyes, and both of them as like me, too, as any 2 stars in the blessed firmament are like each other, where nobody can see a difference. Mary made the best wife in Christendom, and when our little cherubs began to run about our knees, and to lisp and spake to us, 1,000 times have I clasped Mary to my breast, and blessed her as though my heart would burst with joy. Sure, I used to say, what would my own mother have said, had her old eyes been witness to the happiness of her son, Larry McCarthy? But often the thought came sailing over me that my happiness was too like a dram to last long. And it was a dram, and a short one, too. A cruel, mortal fever came to the village, and who should it seize upon but my little darlings? It was hard to see them dying together, and my Mary wept her bright eyes blind over them. But bad luck was upon me. The apothecary told us how our lovely children would die, and on the very day that he said so, the wife that was dearer to me than old Ireland to St. Patrick lay down on the bed beside them. And, oh, sir, before another sun looked in at our window, a dying mother lay between her dead children. I wished that I might die too, and within 3 days I followed my wife and my little ones together to the same grave. It was this arm that lowered them into the cold earth, into the narrow house, and sure it has been weak as a child since. My strength is buried in their grave. I have wrought but little since, for I cannot. I have no home now, and I take a light job anywhere when it comes in my way. Every year, at reaping time, I visit their grave and bring with me a bit of shamrock to place over it, and that it may be a mark where to bury me, should I die here, as I hope I will. Within 10 days after this, I beheld the body of the once lively and generous-hearted Larry McCarthy consigned to the grave by the side of his wife and children. Human life is a fluctuating affair, but after all, there is much more pleasure attached to it. Tears and smiles, it is true, make up its routine, but there's a soul-unburdening joy even in tears. The earth covers physicians' faults, and money rich men's. End of Section 3. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 4 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gini, Rosario. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4, The Battle of Bloody Brook, a passage in American history. Every incident connected with the early history of our country, in which the valor of our forefathers was signally displayed, comes down to us with all the interest of self-love and all the freshness of romance. We love to dwell, for reasons better felt than explained, on the deeds of our sires and the times that tried their souls. There is something hallowed in the associations which gather around us, while reflecting on those instances of devotedness and chivalrous patriotism which distinguished their acts, a feeling almost of devotion. Too many of those deeds have gone down to oblivion, unhonored and unsung, and when a fragment of the past is snatched from the grasp of time, it excites in us sentiments the more sacred from the lapse of years. But there was a period in our country's story, beyond that in which our forefathers struggled to make us a free and happy people, a time whose history is but faintly chronicled, when the sufferings of our pioneer ancestors were unwept and unrequited. That epoch would seem to have been swallowed up in the interest of the events which followed, yet those earlier periods afford us examples of unparalleled sufferance and unmatched heroism. It was a gloomy era, when the fair face of our country was everywhere a dark wilderness, when our pilgrim fathers were at all times surrounded by the beasts and the savages of the forest, and when all was rude and cheerless. In the progress of scenes, from that time forward, many and dangerous were the vicissitudes by which they were marked. The eternal solitude which gave place to the busy hand of the settler, and the umbrageous darkness that disappeared from around his humble domicile, were yet the stilly haunts of the Indian. As the plain, in time, was made to yield support for the newcomer, and the cabins of the white men began to thicken along the valley, the red man reluctantly retired to the mountain. His pleasant places on the uplands, beside the rivers, stocked with the scaly tribes yielding to him sustenance, had become occupied. The level patches where he raised his corn, with the beautiful hills where his tribe loved to congregate, were in the possession of the stranger. His near hunting grounds were disturbed, and his game began to disappear. Thus, dispossessed of his inheritance, and disquieted in his neighboring solitudes, the primitive and rightful lord of the soil deeply fostered a secret hate against the cause of his grievances. As he gathered around his council fire and reflected on the stranger's encroachments, or listened to the complaints of his brethren and the exciting eloquence of his chiefs, his soul began to kindle within him, and his bosom to swell with rage. Already had the numbers of the pale faces become alarming, and their bold hardihood inspired a spirit of dread. The fearful missiles which the stranger so dexterously used, above all excited his fears, and deterred him from manifesting his resentment. Continued irritation, however, overcomes apparent impossibilities, and gradually wears away the most obstinate objections. The cunning of the savage was deemed a match for his enemy. His fleetness, his distant retreats, and his poisoned arrows were presented by the orators to force up his courage to the determined point. Nor was it long before the Indians' festering hate broke forth. The war song now resounded along the mountainside. The fearful yell is heard in the distance, and each settler prepares himself for the worst. And now it was that the direful note of death ran along the Connecticut Valley, and deeds of blood began to desolate the land. For many years was this pleasant valley the scene of heroic struggles, of suffering, and of death. Long did the hardy white man sustain himself against the superior numbers and the wily arts of the savage, but sadly did he pay the cost of his attachment to the land of his choice, and the endearing associations of home. Frequent and deadly were the conflicts in which he engaged with his implacable enemy. Deep and lasting was the mutual hate of the combatants, and as deep and as artful were their schemes of destruction. Victory often crowned the untiring efforts of the foe, when painful captivity or indiscriminate slaughter ensued. To tell of the many murderous deeds and the deep agonies which marked the triumph of the embittered savage would long employ the pen, and harrow up the feelings of the soul. To the cruel perseverance of the Indian, in this war of extermination, were added the secret promptings of base cupidity. The Canadian Frenchmen now urged on the brutal force of the not less barbarous foe by their liberal reward and legalized bounties for captives and for scalps. Still more powerful motives actuated the red men, while large numbers of the reckless whites joined them in the execution of their most desperate deeds. And it was said that the cruelty and brutality of the Frenchman far exceeded those of the savage wild man. It was thus with our forefathers when an attack was anticipated from combined forces of the Indians on the little nucleus of farmhouses at the present beautiful village of Deerfield in Massachusetts. A little army had collected at Hadley, composed of the hardy peasantry of the valley, determined on decisive and desperate efforts against the common enemy. The produce, which had been gathered and housed at Deerfield, was necessary for the support of this band of determined yeomanry and for the affrighted families who had there congregated. Nor was it desirable that so much valuable substance should fall into the hands of the Indians, the more effectually to enable them to continue their bloody warfare. It was therefore resolved that 100 choice young men, justly denominated the flower of the country, should be selected to go with teams in the face of danger and transport the rich products of the soil from Deerfield to Hadley. The expedition was cheerfully undertaken by the requisite number of brave youths. Already were their teams loaded and on their way to the place of destination. The watchful enemy had, however, obtained intelligence of the expedition, and, with the greatest secrecy and celerity, collected in fearful numbers on a neighboring hill, shut out from view by the dense forest with which it was crowned. Here their eloquent chiefs encouraged them, by every effort of language and of gesture, to deeds of bravery and desperation. Their plans were matured and every means devised, which power and strategy could suggest, to destroy the devoted band, and to capture the treasure in their charge. And now their royal leader, with all the force and enthusiasm which had characterized the most potent warrior and consummate general that the history of savage life had ever revealed, broke forth, and thus revealed his great and impassioned mind. Footnote: History makes no mention of King Philip being in this part of the country, either at this or any other time. But from a tradition among the Indians themselves, I am enabled to state with confidence that this great sachem both contrived and led on this attack. Added to this is the historical fact that he was absent from his seat at Mount Hope about this time, no doubt for the purpose of enlisting other tribes in a warfare against the English, and he probably took advantage of the occasion to display to the tribes hereabout his success in planning and his prowess in battle. End of footnote. Warriors, see you the treasures of the pale faces, the richest stores of the long knives? See you the young men, few and feeble, that yonder carelessly stroll in the valley? See you our numbers and the brave warriors that stand around you, and feel not your hearts strong? And who is he that goes before you? Who will direct you in the ambush and the fight? Is it not he who never knew fear, whose heart is like the mountain, and his arm like the forest oak? The great chief of the Narragansetts, whose people are like the leaves, and whose warriors are the terror of the pale faces? Follow him, and all is yours. Each hatchet give a fatal aim. Sink deep these knives, these arrows drink their blood. Away to death, our fathers and our homes. The wild spirit of the proud and lofty Philip ran like electricity through the savage horde. Each burned for the affray, and quickly sprang into the trail of his captain. Silently he glided from the mountain, and cowered along the meadowland that lay in a vale by the roadside. Here, deeply immersed in the luxuriant wild grass, shrink 1,000 warriors, fiend-like, exulting in the anticipated victory and slaughter. Now came the train of teams, cautiously guarded as they had been thus far, by the chosen corps, and descended the small hill which conducted them into the green vale traversed by the road, and near which lay concealed the foe, ready to dart to their prey. Tradition says that here the noble youths, dreaming little of danger from the enemy, rested for the moment, and gathered grapes from the clustering vines that hung thick with their rich fruit by the road, when, sudden as the spark from smitten steel, the 1,000 savage forms sprang from their ambush, and with hideous yells rushed to the onslaught. The vigorous youths, unterrified by the sudden assault, the yells or the fearful numbers of the enemy, instantly rallied, and as quickly brought their rifles to their shoulders. They had received the cloud of arrows as the savages approached within bowshot of their victims. But now, in turn, the fatal lead from a still more deadly weapon made many a warrior bite the ground. The certain aim of the young band had told death to as many of the savage clan. Still onward they pressed, over their dead, and thickly hurled their missiles. Again, with deadly aim, the fire of the little and determined group of whites brought down the foremost of the desperate foe, and threw confusion into their ranks. A gleam of hope broke through the fearful prospect, and for a moment relieved the doubts which the overwhelming numbers and fierce desperation of the savages had inspired. But quickly in front was heard the animating voice of their valiant chieftain, and as quickly did they rally and return their destructive fire. The noble youths, though with half their numbers slain, resolved to sell their lives at a fatal cost. Nor was a nerve thrilled with fear, or a heart disposed to falter, as their ultimate fate now became too plainly apparent. Still onward, with brutal force, wrought to madness by the example and the thundering voice of the gigantic Philip, pressed the exulting foe. To utmost deeds, brave Lathrop now inspired the daring band, as each had caught from him the thrilling cry, "Our God, our homes, our country, and our sires!" But in an instant, pierced with many arrows, he falls among the slain. The heroic captain, the bravest of the brave, now fallen. The enemy express their fiendish joy in loud and terrific yells. The fight thickens, and man conflicts with man. The dying groans of the Christian nerves each youthful arm, which still deeper returns successive blows. Impelled with fury at the destruction which was yet making in the ranks by the almost superhuman efforts of the brave whites, they strove with all the brutality of fiends to complete their deadly work. At length, the number of the valiant youths was reduced to a solitary few, when the foremost of these, on turning to animate his comrades, saw himself supported by 7 only of his associates. These, finding all efforts at victory hopeless, and that longer warfare would but add to the scalps of the victors, dashed their weapons in the face of the foe and attempted to escape. The 2 who stood last in this unequal contest, the most athletic of the chivalrous corps, bounding over the slain, took a direction toward the Deerfield River, followed by 200 Indians, hurling with almost deadly precision their arrows and hatchets. The whizzing of these missiles urged the powerful remnant to their utmost speed. One of these, plunging into the stream, vainly attempted to reach its opposite bank. Pierced by the arrows of the savage, he sank lifeless to the bottom, while the other, running along the shore, screened by the underbrush on its banks, silently sank into the water. Here, amid a thick and dark cluster of weeds and bushes, he supported himself by the trunk of an old tree lying on the edge of the stream, with his face sufficiently elevated to admit of respiration, until the Indians had relinquished their search for him, continually hearing near him their hasty stamp and fearful yells of disappointment. When all was still, and during the darkness of the night, he swam across the river, and stiff and cold began his march for Hadley, where he arrived on the following day, the last and only living witness, as tradition says, of the Battle of Bloody Brook. Reader, this youth was the writer's grandfather. Returning to the spot which history has so justly designated as Bloody Brook, the barbarous enemy, on completing their destruction of life, began that of the dead. The busy scalping knife was doing its frightful office, and the naked heads, severed from the lifeless trunks, were dancing high in air on the points of poles. The sickening sight made the less savage foe revolt. Death had not done its last kind duties when this infernal sport commenced. The convulsive throe still showed the struggle between life and death. The spouting blood, still warm with life, was seen to gush forth from the gaping wounds, and trickling along the greensward find a repository in the gurgling brook nearby. The gory rills were fast purpling the little stream, and transporting the red tide down to oblivion, the richest tide that ever rivulet bore. All around was horror, torture, and death, when suddenly appeared on the crown of the hill a large company of white men who had come from Greenfield with all possible haste to the succor of their brethren. But, alas, it was too late. The scene we have described was presented instead. Filled with rage and madness, this furious band rushed down the hill upon the brutal force, yet gloating in blood and falling like lions among them, made terrible havoc. Alarmed at this furious and unexpected assault, the savages sprang, with fear and desperate fleetness, from the scene, striving only to escape the death which their barbarity so justly merited. but full many a warrior fell by the strong arm of the vengeful white man. Flight alone saved the few remaining enemy. A sad duty now devolved on the final victors. They dug on the spot the rude sepulchre which to this day contains the commingling dust of their youthful brethren, and over its mouth is to be seen a smooth flat stone, the only humble testimonial of posterity. Yes, there by the side of the road, leading from the pretty villages we have mentioned, and near the little brook destined to give immortality to the event, may the curious traveler, as he passes through the green fields of the Connecticut Valley, see the mound which designates the place where fought and sleep the unhonored brave. Peace to thy manes, heroic youths, thy country's history shall preserve thy memory. It is not a little curious, among the phenomena of mind, to mark the effect of external objects in recalling long-lost impressions. While standing on the spot thus hallowed by deeds of bravery, and while dwelling on the scenes which the imagination was picturing before me, I was all at once overwhelmed, as if by a sudden rush of light from the darkness of the past. Circumstances, localities, the realities, in all the vividness with which they were related to me, when but 8 years of age, my grandsire started fresh into life. More than 30 years have elapsed since memory recalled one of those impressions, and yet every word that was dropped from the lips of that venerated man, his actions, his very look, while relating to me the affray at Bloody Brook, came back upon me more freshly than a dream of yesternight. Every incident of that sanguinary fight, that which none in the history of our country was more fatally decisive, came up from the abyss of time, with all the vigor and clearness of present vision. He was then but 18 years of age, of powerful mold, and great muscular activity. The thrilling particulars which he described in his venerable age thus presented themselves to my mind, a short time since, on the consecrated spot to which neither history nor tradition has yet done justice. End of section 4. Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gini Rosario. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5, The Brown Mug by Seba Smith. Returning from a pedestrian excursion to the notch of the White Hills, that wonderful gorge which makes the traveler, the first time he approaches it, stop and hold his breath, and look up to the mountains on the right hand and on the left, and down the deep valley that sweeps away below him, and feel, if he never did before, an overpowering sense of the might and majesty of the eternal. We had wandered down the valley of the clear, swiftly flowing Saco, had tarried a few hours at the beautiful village of Freiburg, had been into the little museum attached to the academy, and tried to hold at arm's length the long gun that shot the Indian chief Paugus. The sight of this gun gave us a strong desire to behold the scene of that memorable and tragical conflict, where the brave Lovewell and his devoted followers, in the heart of the wilderness, 50 miles from any white inhabitants, fought through the long summer day with Paugus and his warriors, till but few on either side were left to tell the news of the encounter. The place was scarcely a mile distant, and taking a guide, we repaired to the spot. How could we do otherwise, when we called to mind the ballad that has embalmed the memory of the unfortunate but heroic little band? With footsteps slow shall travelers go, where Lovewell's pond shines clear and bright, and mark the place where those are laid who fell in Lovewell's bloody fight. So says the old ballad. The name of the bard is lost, but he was a true prophet. Travelers do go and visit Lovewell's pond, and we went among the rest. We stood on its quiet margin and had the various scenes of battle pointed out to us, the place of ambush, the onset, the retreat to the water's edge, and the very spot where Chamberlain is supposed to have stood when he levelled his fowling piece and brought Paugus down. as saith again the old ballad. 'Twas Paugus led the Pequot tribe, as runs the fox would Paugus run, as howls the wild wolf would he howl, a large bearskin had Paugus on. But Chamberlain of Dunstable, one whom a savage ne'er shall slay, met Paugus by the water's side, and shot him dead upon that day. We stood and mused awhile upon the melancholy fate of Lovewell, and Wyman, and Fry, and their brave companions in arms, and then turned silently away and pursued our rambles down the valley of the Saco. We had been upon our excursion about a week, sometimes camping out in the woods, and sometimes emerging into an opening and stopping at some farmhouse to pass the night, when we found ourselves one afternoon approaching a small but tidy-looking dwelling, not many miles from Saco village. The place looked inviting, and our stock of provisions was low. "Come, Joe," said I, "let us try our luck here for something to eat." "Agreed," said Joe, "for I begin to feel hungry as a bear." The house stood a few rods from the road, and as we turned up the lane that led to it, we were suddenly challenged by a little sandy-colored dog, which came running towards us, growling and barking furiously, showing his teeth and bristling the hair on his shoulders like a young wolf. "Let us shoot him," said Joe, "and go about our business." And he actually made a motion to that effect, for he had a little touch of the harum-scarum about him. But I forbade it at once, and told him to put up his rifle. At that moment an old lady appeared and called Jowler stoutly away, who readily obeyed her and retreated behind the house. "Good woman," said I, as we came up to the door, "will you allow us to rest a half-hour in your cottage?" "Oh, certainly, an hour and a half if you've a mind," said the old lady, looking at us sharply through her spectacles. Come in, my door is never closed against a civil caller." With that we followed the old lady into her little parlor, which was furnished in the most simple and plain mode of country life, but exhibited, in a marked degree, an air of neatness and comfort. The chairs she handed us were of round straight posts, with high backs, and the seats woven from the bark of the elm, finely stripped and twisted. The uncarpeted floor looked white and clean enough for a table. A few ordinary pictures hung round the room, which bore such decided marks of age that I at once inferred that they were relics of generations that had gone by. A single oaken chair, of antique appearance, somewhat elaborately carved, stood against the wall between the two front windows, and over it hung a small looking-glass in an oaken frame that looked as though it might have reflected the faces of several successive generations. A modest-looking, fair-faced girl, apparently about 16, sat in the corner of the room with sewing-work in her hands as we entered. She rose and curtsied to us with evident diffidence, and resumed her work. "Good woman," said I, "would it be convenient for you to furnish us with a bit of a lunch?" "Anything at hand, no matter what. We have been in the woods all day, and have not yet dined." "To be sure," said the old lady. "Such as we have shall be at your service in a few minutes. We have nothing very dainty or very nice, but if you have a real appetite for a plain dish, perhaps Sally can pick up something that will answer the purpose. Come, Sally," continued the old lady, addressing the young girl with the sewing work, "set out the table and see if you can't get a mouthful or two of something for the gentleman to eat." As Sally left the room, the eyes of the old lady followed her with doting fondness. "That's my granddaughter," said she, as the door closed. "She has lived with me ever since she was 4 years old, and though I say it myself, there isn't a nicer gal in the whole state of Maine, always ready and willing, and so kind, and always at work. She can get a meal of victuals as well as ever I could in my life, and better than I can now in my old age. There's nothing about the house but what she knows how to do." "She has been fortunate," said I, "to be brought up by such a grandmother." "Well, I don't know," said the old lady. "It seems as if some children take to goodness naturally. I never had the least trouble with her, nothing but to tell her what to do, and she always did it." "But she is not all your family?" said I. "Yes," said the old lady with a sigh. "She and I have lived alone here, now going on 3 years, ever since my poor husband died, heaven rest his soul. His body rests under that willow you see from the window yonder, in the corner of the lot. For the last 2 years of his life he suffered a painful, lingering illness, and to see how that child waited upon him for 2 whole years, almost, as it were, day and night, was enough to melt the heart of Pharaoh. An angel from heaven couldn't have done more than she did. By this time Sally came in again and began to spread the table. The day was warm, and I asked for a glass of water. "Maybe," said the old lady, "you might like a glass of our small beer, made of sarsaparilla and a few greens we get in the woods." I thanked her, and she told Sally to bring some. "Sally, my child," said the old lady, as her granddaughter was going out of the door. Sally turned round. The old lady pointed to a little cupboard door in the corner of the room. Sally, who seemed readily to understand the signal, went to the cupboard, opened the door, took down a large brown earthen mug, and went out. Instantly she returned and placed the mug full of beer upon the table, with a couple of tumblers. We filled the tumblers and drank some of the most delightful beverage we ever tasted. We could not help draining it, upon which the old lady urged us to take some more, adding that we need not be afraid to drink what we liked of it, for it was not only harmless, but very wholesome. We renewed our draught, and in lifting and setting down the mug, I was struck with the peculiar appearance, and took it up and began to examine it. On glancing at the old lady, I perceived an expression of pleasure on her countenance. "Pardon me, madam," said I, "but I think you have a choice article in this mug." "It is a choice article," said the old lady. "It's a mug that we set a great deal by in our family. We don't make much common use of it, but when we have company come in, and particularly strangers, I like to set it before them, for it is in some degree a record of our family history." I still held the mug in my hand, and had discovered a crowned head stamped upon it, and the name of King William. "Ah, then this is an ancient affair, is it?" said I. "But it can't be as old as King Will, can it, though?" "Yes, I believe it is," said the old lady. "It has been in our family about 150 years." "Is it possible?" said I. "Then it must have witnessed some interesting scenes in its day." "It has indeed," said the old lady. "Sit down a few minutes while Sally is bringing in your lunch, and I'll give you a short account of its history." I thanked her heartily and took my seat. "That mug, which we commonly call King William," said the old lady, "because it bears King William's image and name, 150 years ago belonged to my great-grandfather, whose name was Humphrey Scammon. His youngest son, Samuel, was my grandfather, and when I was a child, I have many and many a time sat on his knee, and heard him tell the story of the brown mug, and about being carried away by the Indians. In those days, that is, when my grandfather was a little boy, there were but a few white inhabitants in this part of the county, and they lived in constant fear of being killed or carried off by the Indians. A few families were settled round the Saco Falls, and a few scattered about in other places. They had built a strong fort on the south side of the river, a little below where the village now stands, to which the inhabitants in the vicinity, on any alarm of the approach of Indians, fled for security, and those who were so fortunate as to reach it escaped without injury. Mr. Humphrey Scammon, my great-grandfather, lived on the north side of the river, a mile or two below the fort toward the river's mouth. One day he was out at work with his oldest son, upon a piece of marsh, some ways from the house. Samuel, my grandfather, was then about 10 years old, and remained at the house with his mother. Samuel's mother called him, and told him his poor father and brother were at work hard in the field, and the day was hot, and she wished they had a good mug of her new beer. Samuel at once said he would go and carry some to them, and his mother took that same brown mug, that same King William mug, standing there now on that table, and filled it with beer, and sent Samuel away with it to the field. He had been gone but a very few minutes when he came running, breathless with terror, into the house and crying out, "Mother, mother, the Indians are coming! I see them coming down the hill in the edge of the woods, and they are coming right this way!" In all his fright, he still held the mug of beer in his hands, which he now placed on a shelf in the back part of the room. "Oh, mother, let us fasten the doors," said Samuel, "or they'll come in and kill us." "No, child," said his mother. "If we fasten the doors so they can't open them, they'll set fire to the house and burn us up in it. The only way is to let them come in and take our chance." In a moment more, a dozen savages were at the door and came grimly stalking into the house with their weapons of war in their hands. After reaching the house and helping themselves to such things as they liked, and emptying a couple of feather beds and tacking the ticks for bags to carry away their booty, they demanded of the woman where her husband was. She refused to inform them. They then told her they would kill her and the boy at once, but if she would tell them where her husband was, they would not hurt any of them. This induced her to tell where her husband and other son were at work in the field. The Indians took Mrs. Scammon and Samuel with them and started for the field which had been pointed out to them. Here they succeeded also in making prisoners of Mr. Humphrey Scammon and his son James. Another party of Indians at this time came up, and the whole proceeded up the river, intending to capture all the whites they could find and carry them prisoners to Canada, where they would receive a reward from the French, France at that time being at war with England. They would probably have succeeded in taking more prisoners than they did, and perhaps would have taken the fort itself, had not a fortunate circumstance given seasonable alarm at the falls. A boy by the name of Robinson was passing with a team near the marsh, where Mr. Scammon was captured, and discovered the Indians in time to make his escape. He mounted the horse that was attached to his team, taking his garters for a bridle, and rode with full speed up the river till he came to Gray's Point, a little below the present village, and swam his horse across to Cow Island. Here he left his horse, plunged into the river, and swam the remaining channel himself, flew to the point as fast as possible, and immediately fired the alarm gun. Most of the men of the settlement were away in the fields at work, and many of them at a considerable distance. The women and children, with the feeble old men, fled into the fort as fast as they could, where they had waited but a short time before the Indians made their appearance on the side of the river, and seemed to be preparing to come across to attack the fort. In this emergency, the women arrayed themselves in men's clothing, put on men's hats, and with muskets in their hands, paraded themselves about in different parts of the fort where they could best be seen by the enemy. The Indians, deceived by this formidable array of forces, concluded the men of the settlement were all in the fort and well armed, and that it would be useless to attempt an attack. They accordingly, in a short time, retired, carrying with them the family of Mr. Scammon and a few other prisoners they had taken among the scattering settlements. It isn't worth while to stop and tell now how much the prisoners suffered in their long and tedious journey through the woods to Canada, how they slept on the ground at night with hemlock boughs for their beds, and often traveled all day on foot without a mouthful of food. A year passed away, and nothing had been heard of Humphrey Scammon or his family, and the people on the Saco had given them up for dead. The Indians occasionally continued their hostile invasions through the year, so that the inhabitants on the river dared not venture far from the fort, and when they found it necessary to labor in the field, they kept loaded arms by their sides. But this year, on account of peace taking place between France and England, many of the prisoners in Canada who had been captured in the English colonies by the Indians obtained their liberty and returned home. And one day the people on the Saco were greatly surprised and rejoiced at seeing Mr. Scammon and his family, with several others who had been supposed to be lost, make their appearance among them. After stopping at the fort long enough to partake of refreshments and relate in a hurried manner the principal events of the year, Mr. Scammon was in haste to go and ascertain the condition of his homestead. None of the inhabitants could give him much information respecting it, for not one had visited it since the capture of the family, a fact showing in a striking manner how closely they had been confined to certain limits through fear of the Indians. One of the neighbors indeed told him that he had been down the river about a month before, so far that he could see the house, and that it was still standing and looked very much as it used to. Even this amount of information was received by the returning family with great joy, and with eager haste they started for that dear hut, their home, followed by half a dozen others who volunteered to accompany them. They crossed the river and walked thoughtfully down the river road till they came out of the woods into the little opening that gave them a full view of their former habitation. They instinctively stopped and gazed a minute or two in silence. Mrs. Scammon turned her head away, for her eyes were filled with tears and her face crimsoned with emotion. The sight once more of home, that dear home where she had passed so many happy days, bringing up at once its 1,000 heartfelt recollections, now mingled and shaded with the trials and sufferings of the past year, went at once to the inmost fountain of her heart, and her feelings gushed forth with all the truth and freedom of childhood. The boys, too, wept and laughed in the same breath. Theirs were the tears of joy, for the trials of life had not yet left the rust of sorrow upon their hearts. Mr. Scammon was a hearty, iron-nerved man, but even his chin quivered as he said, "Come, wife, let us go to the house and see if there is anybody there to let us in." The party proceeded on and approached the door of the dwelling. Everything about it was noiseless and motionless as the abode of the dead. Mr. Scammon lifted the latch and they all went in. Almost the first thing that met their eyes was the old house-cat seated upon the window-stool at the back part of the house and looking out of the window. Grey Tabby had lived with them 4 or 5 years, and the idea that she had stuck by the homestead and kept house alone during the whole long year of their absence at once affected them very sensibly. At first, Tabby looked wild and sat out to run away, but when Mrs. Scammon called her, the creature instantly recognized her voice and turned round and ran toward her. She stopped a moment and looked up in her mistress's face, and when Mrs. Scammon patted her on the head, she cried almost like a young child, licked her hand, pressed round and round her feet, leaped upon her clothes and purred, and showed such signs of joy and affection that it brought tears to the eyes of most of the company. They now looked about the house. There were the heaps of feathers which the Indians had emptied out of the beds upon the floor, and there were broken articles of furniture which they had thrown here and there, all lying as they had been left on that fearful day. Presently Samuel stepped along to the shelves in the corner of the room, where he suddenly clapped his hands and called out with great glee, "Oh, mother, here is the very mug of beer that I was carrying out to father that day when the Indians came." They all ran and looked, and there it was, sure enough. They tasted of the beer. It was rather stale, it is true, but there it was, and the mug was more than half full, notwithstanding all the hot days and all the cold days that it had been standing there through the whole year. Mr. Scammon took the mug and looked at it, and said he, "Samuel, now this mug shall be yours, and do you keep it as long as you live, to remember the Indians by." And grandfather did keep it as long as he lived, and when he died, he left it to my father, and when father died, he left it to me. And that's the story of the King William mug that stands on the table there before you, said the old lady. So now set up and take your lunch, for Sally's got it all ready. And pray, good woman, said I, what do you intend to do with the mug when you have done with it? I, said the old lady, when my time comes, and it won't be long, I shall leave the mug to Sally. We seated ourselves at table. I don't know, said the old lady, as you will find much of anything that you can eat. I never knew a more groundless fear in my life, said I, glancing round the table, for indeed a more inviting lunch I never sat down to. There were delicious slices of cold beef's tongue, a rich dish of fried ham and eggs, bread of the very best quality, soft milk biscuit with the freshest and sweetest butter I ever tasted, cup custards, and a perfect gem of an apple pie with rich old cheese. Then there was the brown mug full of excellent beer, and the way the whole was served up was the most perfect pattern of taste and neatness I ever beheld. In short, we ate a very hearty dinner. During the operation of eating, I observed that Joe's eyes wandered very often across the room and rested on Sally, who had again taken her sewing and was seated by the window. Having finished our repast, we prepared to depart. I tried to make the old lady accept of money for the trouble we had caused her, but she seemed hurt and utterly refused. We gave them a parting blessing and went on our way. We walked side by side, Joe and I think nearly a mile, without speaking a word. At last, said I, Joe, you seem to be wrapped up very close in some sort of deep cogitation or other. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking, said Joe, if ever I get married, I mean my oldest son shall inherit the brown mug. Note, The story of the brown mug, with most of the other incidents in this sketch, is no fiction, but the simple truth. End of section 5.
Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6, The Attacked Escort, a Spanish Scene. In 1810, I was in the French service and ordered with my regiment to Bayonne. Frequent convoys were sent forward into Spain, sufficiently numerous to keep off the guerrillas, and to one of those I was attached on its way to Andalusia. Our convoy was strong, a corps of infantry, dragoons, and artillery, escorting a long train of wagons with stores. Our march was through a fine part of the country, and in the finest season of the year, the close of spring. We proceeded slowly, and had full leisure to enjoy the landscape. The Spanish spring realizes all those ideas of beauty, those skies of cloudless blue and splendid sunshine, those blossomed fields and light and delicious airs that in other lands are scarcely more than the language of poetry. The convoy moved with the usual military precautions, though it was too strong to be liable to a guerrilla attack. We could not, however, prevent desultory skirmishes in the defiles, by which we lost some men. Even this, in some degree, added to the interest of our march. On the first report of a musket, the column closed. Our mountain voltigeurs and light infantry were sent up the hills to turn the flank of the Spaniards, and apart from the loss of lives, the scene was often in the highest degree striking and picturesque. In this mode we passed on till we reached the Sierra Morena. There the badness of the roads, which had been neglected from the commencement of the war, broke a considerable number of our wagons, and as we had now reached a country completely in the power of our troops, the officer in command thought it better to move forward with the main body than linger for their repair. Some 100 men were left behind to escort them, with orders to follow to a town 3 marches off, which was to be the headquarters of the convoy. I had been taken ill, and remained with the wagons. The delay, however, was trifling, and in 24 hours we were on the road again. Unluckily, the commandant of the escort, in order to make up for our lost time, took it into his head to move by a narrow forest road, instead of that through the open country, which made a circuit of some extent. I observed to him the hazard of this route. He gave me civilly to understand that I was not then at the head of my regiment. I said no more, and we plunged into the forest. For some time all went on well, but the forest grew thicker, the road narrower and more broken, and at last a grove of oaks brought us almost to a stop. We here found our advanced dragoons, who waited for the column, that they might not be entangled alone in the grove. We had scarcely worked ourselves a dozen yards among the trunks and copse, when an advanced sharpshooter fired, and in a moment after we saw men with muskets in their hands running round us. Their numbers increased rapidly, and we soon had them in every direction, front, flanks, and rear. Our commandant had now found out his mistake, and had nothing to do but to get out of it as well as he could. The column had halted at once. The infantry were posted at its head and in the rear of the wagons. The sharpshooters formed line on each side from front to rear, and the dragoons were pushed into the wood on both sides of the road at 20 paces off to act as skirmishers. The fire had already begun, and the enemy had all the advantage. He might single us out as he pleased, while we might take our revenge by firing at the trees. We saw some of our dragoons tumble from their horses, while others galloped back to us wounded. Platoons of infantry were advanced to support them, and they soon began to feel the effects of the fire. Our next experiment was to send 30 dragoons to cut down everything before them. They charged gallantly, but they could not cut down oaks and elms of 100 years' growth, and in a few minutes we saw about one half of the troop gallop back again, followed by a shout and a shower of balls. We were now situated awkwardly enough, and in fact had nothing for it but fighting. The commandant was a good officer, though he had entered the wood, and the soldiers fired desperately. We made our way, losing men continually, till we got on until we came to an abattis of trees in the very heart of the forest. Here we fought for life and death. The enemy, though only peasants, were bold in capital shots, and it was not till after an hour of despair and carnage that we broke through the barrier, wound our way through the forest, and saw the light of heaven. This cost us nearly all our wagons, 2/3 of our escort, the commandant a severe wound in the knee, and me a ball in the shoulder. This was an unlucky affair, and it left us all in ill humor. We moved on, determined to try no more short-cuts, and about half a league further saw another grove. We all shrank at the sight, but above the trees we saw, at a turning of the road, the chimneys of a chateau. This, of course, would afford quarters for the officers, and hospital for the wounded, and plunder for the rest. I now remonstrated on the necessity of losing no more time, but the commandant's wound had made him outrageous, and the sight of Spanish property was not easily resisted among our troops at that period. So it was determined to try what was inside of the chateau. We left the few carriages that remained to us in the road, and sent our sharpshooters up the Grand Avenue, a stately range of oaks. There was not a soul to be seen in the house. The windows were closed, and but that the dogs barked fiercely, we should have thought that the whole had been visited by the plague. The soldiers hammered the great door with the butt ends of their muskets, flung stones at the windows, and at last began to fire at the shutters. All was useless. At length, as we were beginning to lay faggots against the door, a small window was opened, and a man's voice inquired what we wanted. One of our officers, who had served in Spain, answered that we wanted to get in and to have some refreshment and rest. The voice replied and bade us go to a farmhouse in sight, where we should find provisions. No, said the officer, that is not enough. Open the door, or we will get in spite of you. You shall not get in, said the voice. We have force enough to defend ourselves. Retire at your peril. This defiance put the troops in a rage. They looked on it as an insolent challenge, and while some of them prepared to scale the windows, others ran off to bring up our guns to burst open the door. The commandant, however, would not allow them to be used, in the fear of bringing the guerrillas upon him again. At length they broke open the door with the levers of the guns. As it fell in, a line of 50 men drawn up in the court within fired a volley that knocked down one half of those in front. The rest fell back for a moment, but the whole corps now rushed on and filled the court before the Spaniards had time to reload. A few of them were killed on the spot, but the greater part made good their retreat into the chateau, and from that into the grounds, where our soldiers, as soon as they saw the rich furniture of the rooms, did not think it worth their while to follow them. I was extremely grieved at this whole affair, and indignant and pained as I was at so much unnecessary evil. I was led, partly by curiosity and partly by a wish to be of what service I could to the unfortunate people of the house, to enter the court and see what was going forward. At this time the first attack was over, and the soldiers had gained possession of the apartments above, but there was still a scene going on that I shall never forget. Some of the Spaniards had either been unable or disdained to retreat, and at the further end of the court, against the wall of a chapel, stood 6 or 7 men who seemed determined to die. They had made a little breastwork of some loose wood, and from behind this they kept up a regular discharge. I remarked among them a very noble-looking man in an embroidered cloak, who appeared to be their master, and beside him a boy of 15 or 16, who cried out continually, "Kill, kill the French." This lasted a few minutes, and we lost some men at every discharge, till at last our soldiers, infuriated at this defence by a handful of servants, rushed forward. 7 or 8 took aim together at the master and fired. I saw the boy fall. At the moment the master staggered a few paces back, and then advancing flung himself beside the body. The servants at this sight lost courage, threw away their arms, and springing upon the pieces of wood, climbed over the wall, and made their escape through the gardens, our soldiers offering them no interruption, as the resistance was fairly at an end, and they were anxious only to share the plunder with their comrades in the chateau. My servant and I were now the only persons in the court, and I was so much shocked and disgusted with the whole scene of rapine and cruelty that I did not know whether to advance or retire. I saw the court covered with dead, and felt the natural shudder of every man not altogether hardened at beholding death in such a shape, while the ear was filled with the shoutings, a riot of plunder above. But as I gave a last look to the spot where those gallant and unfortunate Spaniards had made their last stand, I thought I saw a hand waved from among the corpses. I immediately went up to them. The first face that I saw was the boy's. It was turned upward, and pale as it was, I think I never saw one so handsome. It still retained a slight expression of disdain, which gave a kind of loftiness to its extreme beauty, and reminded me, even in that moment, of the Belvedere Apollo. But he was totally dead. It was natural to feel something at such a sight. I continued almost involuntarily gazing on the face, till I was roused by seeing the figure at his side raised itself slowly from the ground, and sitting up looked me in the face, saying in a low tone, "Barbarians, is not this enough?" I absolutely felt as if an apparition had risen before me. The hollow voice, the large eyes nearly glazed, and yet haughty and threatening, absolutely checked my breath. However, I made some steps toward the wounded man, in the idea of offering him assistance. He evidently misconceived me, and turning himself round with pain, clasped his arms over the boy, kissed his lips 2 or 3 times, and then looking up at me, seemed to await the mortal blow. I was doubly shocked at this, and I believe a tear stole into my eye. I told him in Spanish that he was wrong in taking me for one of his murderers, that I was deeply grieved at all I saw, and that if I could not help those round him, I might be of some service, at least to himself. He fixed his eyes on me and said, "You are a Frenchman, and yet can feel." It was no time to enter into explanation. I merely replied, I wished to take him from that place, and desired to know where my servant and I should carry him to shelter. "It is too late. I am dying. If it were otherwise, I should not," and he looked at his son's corpse, "at this moment be so calm." I still entreated him. "Well then," said he, "if you will do me this last kindness, have me carried into the chapel, where my place has long been prepared." I raised him by the knees. My servant put his hands under his head, and in this way we carried him gently toward the chapel. It was then that I first saw that he was mortally wounded. The door of the chapel was open, and there we laid down our melancholy burden. Under all the depression of the moment, I could not help being struck with admiration as I glanced round. The altar, columns, steps were all of the finest marble and the most exquisite sculpture, but the most striking object was a monument of Carrara marble in the center. It was a dome on 4 pillars, under which was a female figure lying on its side, with the head resting on the arm as in deep sleep. The face and form were of exquisite loveliness. At the 4 corners of the monument were 4 large wax tapers burning, and a large black pall, which appeared to have been covering the figure, lay beside it on the ground. The wounded gentleman was evidently exhausted by his last effort. I spoke to him, but he was unable to answer. As his oval countenance gradually assumed the calmness of death, I never saw anything nobler. He could not be more than between 40 and 50. The large black eye, the arched brow, the cheek slightly tinged with emotion, the mouth moved with a faint smile which seemed to say that all human efforts were hopeless, and that yet he thanked me, all made up such a face as we see in the pictures of Titian or Da Vinci. It was the Spanish countenance in all its grandeur and all its melancholy. I gave him some wine and water from my servant's canteen, and after an effort he said in a dying tone, "Sir, I had once a wife, an admirable creature. Heaven took her from me in the most unfortunate and painful manner. She was worthy of heaven. She died 5 years ago. I built this tomb for us both. Lay me beside her." I could not speak. He pressed my hand and said again, "Sir, I thank you for your feelings. If you will let me make one more request, it shall be my last. Bring the body of my boy, that I may look upon him once more and die with him beside me." I shrank at this. The place was now entirely silent. The soldiers had either gone away or were busy in the remote parts of the chateau. There was nothing round me but graves and death. I felt an involuntary horror at going into the court, where I should see but bleeding bodies. I will own that I felt a dimness come over my eyes and shook like a woman. The noble Spaniard would urge me no farther. He sat up, lifted his clasped hands, and fixed his eyes on heaven, and after a struggle, obviously of inward prayer, sank back on the ground with a sigh which made me think that all was over. This awoke me. I went out, and with my servant, whom I found at the door, brought in the body of the boy and placed it by his father's side. While I was gazing on them as they lay together in their sad beauty, I saw the curtain of the altar rise slowly, and from under it peep an old man, who looked round him in great terror. I called to him to come forward and promised him safety. He was an old servant of the family, and on seeing the bodies he was in an agony of grief, flung himself on them, tore his white hair, and cursed, as well he might, their murderers. As he clasped his master's hand, I saw the eyes open. They were turned upon the boy's countenance, then on me. I heard the lips whisper, "God bless the hand that brought us together." Then laying his arm round the boy's neck and pressing his lips to his cheek, the spirit departed with a deep sigh. The old servant and I knelt beside them, and I believe wept together. After a while we heard the soldiers returning. We rose and covered the bodies with the pall from the tomb. The chapel was now nearly dark, and the soldiers came in with lighted torches. They asked what was under the pall, and on being told, turned away with looks and gestures of genuine regret. They did not even look at the servant, who stood close to me, expecting to be put to death, notwithstanding my assurances of safety. The drums now beat, the plunder was gathered into the court. Cars and wagons from the stables were loaded with the rich movables of the mansion. I waited until all were on the march, then giving some money to the old man, and bidding him call the fugitive domestics to do the last honours to his masters, I walked with a melancholy heart through the deserted court and followed the troops. From the first rising ground, I looked back upon the chateau. The moon was touching its towers, and when I thought of what was below, I formed my fixed resolution of being a soldier no more. End of Section 6. Section 7 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7. American Generals. Washington was a surveyor and in afterlife a farmer. Knox was a bookbinder and stationer. Morgan, he of the cowpens, was a drover. Tarleton got from him a sound lecture on that subject. Greene was a blacksmith and withal a Quaker, albeit through all his Southern campaigns, and particularly at the Utah Springs, he put off the outward man. Arnold, I ask pardon for naming him, was a grocer and provision store keeper in New Haven. Gates, who opened Burgoyne's eyes to the fact that he could not march through the United States with 5,000 men, was a regular built soldier, but after the Revolution a farmer. Warren, the martyr of Bunker Hill, was a physician. Marion, the old fox of the South, was a cowboy. Sumter, the fighting cock of South Carolina, was a shepherd's boy. End of Section 7.
Section 8 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8. Beauty. What is beauty? Alas, 'tis a jewel, a glass, a bubble, a plaything, a rose. 'Tis the sun, dew, or air, 'tis so many things rare, that 'tis nothing one well may suppose. 'Tis a jewel, love's token, glass easily broken, a bubble that vanisheth soon, a plaything that boys cast away when it cloys, a rose quickly faded and strewn. Like the air it is felt, like snow it will melt, it refresheth the earth like the dew, and as nothing can vie with a brilliant blue eye, 'tis like nothing, sweet lady, but you. End of Section 8, read by Alan Mapstone.
Section 9 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 9. T'other End of the Gun. Change for American Notes. Harpers, Sam Slick in England, William H. Colyer. These two very clever pamphlets ought to have been published by the same house and bound up together, either of them being a capital commentary upon and complement to the other. It is really curious to observe how nearly the broad humor of Judge Halliburton and the biting wit of the American lady are exercised upon the same points of English peculiarity, and how in the main the colonial high Tory and the spirited Republican woman arrive at the same results in their views of life in England. The dreary monotony of manners, the melancholy homage to wealth, the utter absence of nature and elasticity, with the almost universal prevalence of sullen prejudice and absurd cant, excite equally the caustic merriment of both of these cis-Atlantics, while both at the same time do ample justice to the industry, the energy, and manifold virtuous, though homely traits of these brave, mechanical, whimsical, and world-formidable islanders. John Bull, who holds such an Ishmaelitish pen against all other nations, of course makes many wry faces at having the chalice commended to his own lips which he is so often drugged for others, and Mr. Slick, with his female accomplice in mixing the posset, must not expect to come off more easily than did General Pillet. Prince Puckler, Muscow, Baron de Houses, Slidell, Mackenzie, Fenimore Cooper, and others who called out the most rabid fury against them in England for the home truths they venture to tell. It is really remarkable that a great and powerful nation should be so sensitive when strangers, for their own good, point out those unhappy defects in their manners which make the English so unpopular all over Christendom, while at the same time the whole world, with one consent, unite in doing justice to their brilliant and extraordinary career as a nation. Their insular position and their exclusion from social intercourse with the rest of Europe during the wars of Napoleon must account for much of this childish feeling, a feeling indeed which even the incessant contact of our countrymen with foreigners from every clime has not prevented them from partially sharing, though the incessant wave of immigration which dashes on these favorite shores polishes away our corners and makes us more completely citizens of the world. We subjoin some extracts from these racy volumes. "It is rather hard talking, that," said he. "I like its patronizing tone. There's something goodish in a colonist patronizing a Britisher. It's turning the tables on 'em. It's sarving 'em out in their own way. Lord, I think I see old Bull put his eye-glass up and look at you with a dead aim and hear him say, 'Come, this is cutting it rather fat,' or as the feller said to his second wife when she tapped him on the shoulder, 'Marm, my first wife was a Percy, and she never presumed to take that liberty.' Yes, that's good, squire. Go it, my short-tails. You'll win if you get in fust. See if you don't. Patronizing a Britisher, a critter that has Lucifer's pride, Arkwright's wealth, and Bedlam's sense. Ain't it rich?" Sam's opinion of Dickens. "What is the temper," he replied, with much warmth, "that they visit us in? Cuss 'em. Look at Dickens. Was there ever a man made so much of, except Lafayette? And who was Dickens? Not a Frenchman that is a friend to us, not a native that has a claim on us, not a colonist, who though English by name is still an American by birth, 6 of one and half a dozen of t'other, and therefore a kind of half-breed brother. No, he was a cussed Britisher, and what was a British author, and yet because he was a genius, because genius has the tarnal globe for its theme, and the world for its home, and mankind for its readers, and being a citizen of this state or that state, but a native of the universe, why we welcomed him, and feasted him, and levied him, and escorted him, and cheered him, and honored him. Did he honor us? What did he say of us when he returned? Read his book. No, don't read his book, for it ain't worth reading. Has he said one word of all that reception in his book, that book that will be read, translated, and read again all over Europe? Has he said one word of that reception? Answer me that, will you? Darn the word. His memory was bad. He lost it over the taffrail when he was seasick, but his notebook was safe under lock and key, and the pigs in New York, and the chap, the rats eat in jail, and the rough man from Kentucky, and the entire raft of gals imprisoned in one night, and the spittin' boxes, and all that stuff warn't trusted to memory. It was noted down and printed. English civility. There's plenty of civility here in England if you pay for it. You can buy as much in 5 minutes as will make you sick for a week, but if you don't pay for it, you not only won't get it, but you get sarse instead of it. That is, if you are fool enough to stand and have it rubbed in. They are as cold as Presbyterian charity, and mean enough to put the sun in eclipse, are the English. They ain't set up the brazen image here to worship, but they've got a gold one, and that they do adore, and no mistake. It's all pay, 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 parquisite, 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 extortion, extortion, extortion. There is a whole pack of yelping devils to your heels here, for everlastingly a cringin', fawnin', and coaxin' or snarlin', grumblin' or bullyin' you out of your money. There's the boatman and the tide waiter, and porter and customer, and truckman as soon as you land, and the sarvant man, and chamber gal, and boots and porter again to the inn, and then on the road there is a trunk lifter and a coachman, and guard and beggarman, and a critter that opens the coach door that they calls a waterman, 'cause he is infernal dirty and never sees water. They are just like a snarl of snakes. Their name is Legion, and there ain't no Eend to 'em. The only thing you get for nothing here is rain and smoke, the ramotes and scorny airs. If you could buy an Englishman at what he was worth and sell him at his own valuation, he would realize as much as a nigger and would be worth trading in. That's a fact. But as he ain't worth nothing, there's no market for such critters. No one would buy him at no price. A Scotsman is wuss, for he is prouder and meaner. Pat ain't no better nother. He ain't proud 'cause he has a hole in his breeches and another in his elbow, and he thinks pride won't patch him. And he ain't mean 'cause he ain't got nothing to be mean with. Whether it takes 9 tailors to make a man, I can't exactly say. But this I will say, and take my Davy of it too, that it would take 3 such gonies to make a pattern for one of our real, genuine, free, and enlightened citizens, and then I wouldn't swap without large boot, I tell you. Guess I'll go and pack up my fixins and have 'em ready to land. The Nelson Monument, there he is, as big as life, 5 feet nothing, with his shoes on. Now examine that monument, and tell me if the English don't know how to brag as well as some other folks, and whether they don't brag to some times when they hain't got no right to. There's 4 figures there representing the 4 quarters of the globe in chains, and among them America a crouching down and a begging for life like a mean Injun. Well, just do the civil now, and tell me when that little bragging feller ever whipped us, will you? Just tell me the day of the year when he was ever able to do it, since his mammy cut the apron string and let him run to seek his fortune. Heavens and arth, we'd chawed him right up. No, there never was an officer among you that had anything to brag of about us but one, and he warn't a Britisher. He was a despisable blue-nosed colonist boy of Halifax. When his captain was took below, wounded, he was lieutenant, so he just ups and takes command of the Shannon and fit like a tiger, and took our splendid frigate Chesapeake, and that was something to brag on. And what did he get for it? Why, colony sarce, half pay, and leave to make room for Englishers to go over his head. And here is a lying false monument erected to this man that never even seed one of our national ships, much less smelt thunder and lightning out of one that English like has got this for what he didn't do. Nature, you are in the wrong view here, squire, said he, you are, upon my soul. If you think to sketch the English in a way any one will stop to look at, you have missed a figure, that's all. You can't do it, nohow you can fix it. There's no contrasts here, no variations of colors, no light and shade, no nothing. What sort of a picture would straight lines of anything make? Take a parcel of sodgers, officers and all, and stretch 'em out in a row, and paint 'em, and then engrave 'em, and put it into one of our annuals, and see how folks would larf and ask, what boardin' school gal did that? Who pulled her out of standing corn and sot her up on Eend? For an artist, they'd say. There is much of elegance and more of comfort in England. It is a great and good country, Mr. Poker, but there is no nature in it. It is true as gospel. I'm telling you no lie. It's a fact. If you expect to paint them English, as you have the blue noses and us, you'll pull your line up without a fish oftener than you are a-thinking on. That's the reason all our folks have failed. Rush's book is just molasses and water, not quite so sweet as 'lasses, and not quite so good as water, but a spillin' of both. And why? His picture was of polished life, where there is no nature. Washington Irving's book is like a Dutch paintin'. It is good because it is faithful. The mop has the right number of yarns, and each yarn has the right number of twists, although he mistook the mop of the grandfather for the mop of the man of the present day, and the pewter plates are on the kitchen dresser, and the other little notions are all there. He has done the most that could be done for them, but the painter deserves more praise than the subject. Why is it every man's sketch of America takes? Do you suppose it is the sketches? No. Do you reckon it is the interest we create? No. Is it our grand experiments? No, they don't care a brass button for us, or our country, or experiments nother. What is it then? It is because they are sketches of nature, nature in every grade, and every variety of form, from the silver plate and fork to the finger and hunting knife. Our artificial Britishers laugh at that. They are bad copies, that's a fact. I give them up, let them laugh and be darned, but I stick to my nature, and I stump them to produce the like. They are considerable large print. Are the Bull family, said he. You can read them by moonlight. Indeed, their faces ain't on like the moon, in a genial way. Only one has got a man in it, and the other ha'n't always. It ha'n't a bright face. You can look into it without winking. It's a cloudy one here, too, especially in November, and most all the time makes you rather sad and solemn-colly. Yes, John is a moony man, that's a fact, and at the full a little queer sometimes. England is a stupid country compared to ourn. There is no variety where there is no nature. You have class variety here, but no individuality. They are insipid, and call it perlite. The men dress alike, talk alike, and look as much alike as Providence will let 'em. The clubhouses and the tailors have done a good deal toward this, and so has Whiggism and Dissent, for they have destroyed distinctions. But this is too deep for me. Ask Minister. He will tell you the cause. I only tell you the fact. Dining out here is both heavy work and light feeding. It's monstrous stupid. One dinner like one rainy day. It's rained ever since I've been here a'most. It is like another. One drawing room like another drawing room. One peer's entertainment in a general way is like another peer's. The same powdered, liveried, lazy, idle, good-for-nothing, do-little stand in the way of each other, useless sarvants. Same pictures, same plates, same fixins, same don't know what to do with yourself kinder a-looking master. Great folks are like great folks, marchants like marchants, and so on. It's a picture, it looks like life, but it tain't. The animal is tamed here. He is fatter than the wild one, but he ha'n't the spirit. Stray touches. Lord, how extremes meet sometimes, as Minister says. Here, now fashion, is the top of the pot, and that pot hangs on the highest hook on the crane. In America, nature can't go farther. It's the royal thing. Look at the womankind now. An Injun gal down south goes most naked. Well, a splendiferous company gal here, when she is full dressed, is only half covered, and neither of 'em attract you one mite or morsel. We dine at 2 and sup at 7. Here they lunch at 2 and dine at 7. The words are different, but they are identical the same. Oh, of course it isn't true, he said, and every Englishman will swear it's a falsehood, but you must not expect us to disbelieve it, nevertheless, for your travellers who come to America pick up here and there some absurd untruth or another, or if they are all picked up already, invent one, and although every man, woman, and child is ready to take their Bible oaths, it is a bam, yet the English believe this one false witness in preference to the whole nation. I ain't a vain man, and never was. You know, squire, I ha'n't a mossel of it in my composition. No, if you were to look at me with a ship's glass, you wouldn't see a grease spot of it in me. I don't think any of us Yankees is vain people. It's a thing don't grow in our diggins. We have too much sense in a general way for that. Indeed, if we wanted any, we couldn't get none for love nor money, for John Bull has a monopoly of it. He won't open the trade. It's a home market he looks to, and the best of it is, he thinks he ha'n't none to spare. The racy character of Judge Halliburton's last and best work is sufficiently shown by the above extracts. We hope it is a pardonable egotism to record how much we have been both pleased and pained to observe how often the scene of his best stories, told in illustration of his theme, is laid in Maine. We were pleased at this unconscious acknowledgment of the original Jack Downing's source, whence the first fruit of these admirable and deservedly popular writings was drawn, and pained that our own careless thunder was more completely lost to us than ever when fashioned into full-form bolts by a hand so capable to wield them. Yet such is often the fate of the literature. His mind, like the stream which unconsciously runs over the golden mine, disengages at times the rich ore below, and bears it careless onward till it meets some more fortunate eye, some more favoured hand, some really gifted mortal, who has both the leisure to trace and the skill to work the wealth-bestowing vein which another has disclosed to him. But it is time for us to turn to the change for American notes, which will be found to ring almost as hard as the generous coin which our friend Mr. Slick scatters so profusely. We may observe before leaving the subject that we are perfectly aware that some who may peruse this article will lift up their hands in holy horror at the extracts we have already made and those we are about to begin, exclaiming the while against what in ladylike phrase is called the bad taste of the spirit of reconciliation. Reconciliation, quotha! We reject the phrase. Does the Bedouin reconciliate with the assassin who thrusts a knife into his vitals, even while partaking of his salt? How bitter, how persecutingly bitter and unsparing has been the obloquy of this people, the beat of whose writers knew only to enter our houses, to sit at our board, to drink of our cup, to be feasted and fostered by us, like our brethren, only to return home, and hold us up to the scorn and contempt of the rest of the civilized world. Yes, but we should pass over these things with the disdain that becomes a great people. Out upon such wretched cant, is disdain then the fitting punishment for crime? For crime we say, and say it unhesitatingly, for next to that wickedness which robs the soul of its belief in a hereafter, is the social outrage upon feeling which teaches the heart that hospitality to the stranger is a weakness, that we must doubt the honesty of our fellow man who comes to us from a foreign shore, and open our doors to him at the peril of our character. English and American manners. The English contend that there is not in the United States a refinement of manners equal to their own. There may not be the parade of it. The English bow and walk differently, they say, more gracefully, they simper and small talk more, and though they may flatter ladies more, they do not prize them so much, while the treatment of our sex is the best touchstone of real refinement and civilization. I cannot conceive anything more absurd or bolder in its absurdity than for travelers to assert, while they admitted the irreproachable character of American ladies, that they exercised little influence upon society. As well say there was much sunshine in the state of Georgia, but it had little effect upon the produce of the earth. I confess I have very considerable doubts of this refinement of manners in English gentlemen, and for this plain reason: it is not rooted in them, it is not manifested when they are not under conventional restraint. They must be polite and forbearing in ladies' society, but see the same gentleman strolling along the fashionable streets, and which of them will refrain from staring audaciously at every stranger lady he meets, no matter who she may be? Did any one of the ladies of Queen Victoria's court venture to walk out unattended, she would be subjected to this vulgar persecution. This is one reason why the use of carriages of all kinds is so very frequent. Ladies cannot walk forth alone. I've heard it stated, these are chiefly the manners of young gentlemen. They may learn better as they grow older. Is it not rather a novelty to advance youth as an excuse for arrogant impropriety, where an American gentleman would quietly step aside to allow a lady of any condition in life to pass without annoyance? An English gentleman will loiter to stare pertinaciously, and to his full satisfaction. Her dissatisfaction is nothing cared about. Which is the best mannered? To say that they are not English gentlemen who act thus is equivalent to saying there is hardly an English gentleman in the streets of London, even in the streets where, from the number of clubhouses or other causes, they most do congregate. Drawing-room manners seem to be accounted all sufficient for a London gentleman. He is emancipated from the thraldom when he exchanges the wax light for the open air. Another doctrine, if I may call it so, passes for orthodox, that a royal court and a titled aristocracy tend to the refinement of all classes, down to the lowest, that their refinement influences all manner of men. This, I think, is one of the many dogmas here, whose right suits not in native colours with the truth. At any rate, there seems but the horn of a dilemma for those who have faith in this English credence. The lowest classes in this kingdom are coarse, brutal, and stupid beyond those of the United States, so that either it is not in the nature of things that this vaunted refinement should duly reach the poorest plebeians, or, more probably, that it exists not in vigor enough to do so. I think, therefore, that this much extolled attribute of British aristocracy is but conventional gentility, a mere surface of elegance, because consistent refinement is not shown in the gentlemen's manners, while their favourite place of amusement is often remarkable for the opposite of true refinement. It yields but a vulgar joy. Meddlesome disposition. Of the fondness of the English for foreign grievances one should not speak too severely, it may be, but the sort of feeling honest Rip Van Winkle had, for Rip was fond of attending to anybody's business rather than his own. To be sure, one cannot but wonder that so little is thought of the cry throughout the kingdom for more churches, schools, and hospitals, and so much of the wants of rather dubious people who dwell or roam by the Nile or Niger. It may be thought strange, I say, that they who wish to instruct the natives of Nubia may not care to teach the dwellers in Lancashire, but it may be contended also that Nubia is or should be the better for them, and Lancashire can be none the worse. The Americans have their foreign schools and missions, but they care, and amply, for home instruction first. I would not be thought anxious to censure too freely the sometimes rather theatrical displays of Exeter Hall touching these foreign matters. Mr. N. accounts for them by saying that there is here, so with us, a large class of young ladies who conscientiously abjure as sinful the pleasures of the ballroom or the theatre, and as it really appears a necessity of our nature to have some enjoyment or excitement, Exeter Hall serves occasionally for an assembly room and a stage. We must not searchingly inquire what's in a name. Love of country. I do not think that abstract love of country flourishes in England, and it may be true that were any great demand made upon the virtue, the patriotism, the self-denial of the people, the utmost danger to the state might be apprehended, for instead of these qualities there might be found in the ranks of the prosperous the curse of prosperity, heartlessness, in the mass of the middle classes, deep-rooted and most robust selfishness, and in the poor, ignorance, and its constant comrade recklessness. But this is to put a very extreme case. Cleanliness. There is nothing in London at all comparable to the Croton Aqueduct. The London waterworks are no doubt very surprising, but there is nothing to be seen. The water slinks into the city, as it were, in a surreptitious manner. Public fountains are almost unknown. the few there are being so paltry that a Frenchman pitied the water degraded to their use. He was probably fresh from Versailles. In some districts there are complaints of the badness of the water, that it is unfit for any purposes but those of cooking or washing. This might have been remedied long ago, did not so many believe that water could be wanted for no other purposes. Gumption. I was once remarking how free England was from destructive beasts. Yes, said a lady present, and England is free from another thing, slaves. At least, thought I, for I very rarely argue, unless by post. They do not call them by that name in this country. I've heard silly remarks about slavery from London ladies, and on both sides of the question, Mrs. Trollope, in a fit of unaccustomed candour, has penned this passage. I've listened to much dull and heavy conversation in America, but rarely to any that I could strictly call silly, if I except the everywhere privileged class of very young ladies. It is true the novelist labours hard afterward by narrating foolish talk to prove the reverse of her own assertion. Still she ought to have all honour for this admission, whether made through thoughtlessness or inadvertency or not. I cannot conscientiously say so much of English conversations, even with the exception made. I was asked the other day by Mrs. Blank, a lady of what Mrs. T. would call high standing, if the United States were as well witted as England. Her 2 eldest daughters, she added, had a little debate on the subject, and as the younger children's governess was absent, she could not be referred to. Repudiation. I've heard of one of those schoolmasters who did not expose his scholars, or rather the boys committed to his care, for there was small scholarship in the case, to any ill that flesh may be heir to from overfeeding, but nevertheless attributed all their ailments, bodily or mental, to their gluttony, colds or fevers, dullness or impudence. It still was gluttony. One day a poor boy broke his leg out of doors and was carried to the master. "Ay, lad," he exclaimed, "I always told you this, a broken leg, all owing to your gluttony." And so all the evils of England or America are charged by the short-sighted in both countries upon the devoted heads of aristocracy and democracy, gluttons both, if we believe such scribes in their appetite for wrong. How is the evil to be attributed to these antagonistic causes, if it be the same on both sides of the Atlantic? Repudiation, for instance. The Bank of England, in the recollection of many not very old people, repudiated cash payments, and this I heard was by direct order from the government, issued on a Sabbath day. To be sure, I also heard this corrected to the Lord's Day, which certainly mends the matter. The governor and company of the Bank of England promised, in very intelligible print, to pay £1 or so many pounds on demand for value received. When the demand was made, how was it complied with? Not by payment in specie for the acknowledged receipt of value, but by another promise to pay on cleaner and uncrumpled paper. Perhaps this was not exactly what is now called repudiation. It seems to me, moreover, that when the British rulers, by an arbitrary act, reduced the rate of interest from 5 to 3.5%, they repudiated a part of the engagement to which public faith was pledged, and this in addition to the refusal to pay in specie. I'm sorry the Reverend Sidney Smith had occasion to write his letter on the subject of the non-payment of interest due on the money borrowed from this country by the state of Pennsylvania. The Britannia, a pleasant and clever paper, generally attributed this repudiation, as it is too commonly called, to democracy. In former years, when the interest was regularly paid, to what was that to be attributed? Pennsylvania was as democratic then. The ancient monarchies of Spain and Portugal do not pay their debts, principal or interest, to this country. Democracy again, I suppose. Other states of the American Union are punctual in their payments. Are not they democratic? Geography. I told you before how ignorant were very many of the English about America. Mr. Wilderton and his family, confident in my Englishism, sometimes sportively turn the conversation to Yankee topics when anyone is present who does not know I'm a native of America. The other day a young lady, with voice and complexion alike raised, told us how she had been reading some missionary tracts, and then exclaimed against the cruelties practiced by the American government upon the poor heathen, the benighted Indians. We soon found that she had ingeniously gathered all Indians, and it is so very vague and general a term, into one grand aggregate, and imputed the sufferings and wrongs of the natives of Hindustan, Australia, and North and South America all to our government. By what mental process she had arrived at this conclusion I do not know, but it appears there is sometimes an ingenuity even in ignorance. This young lady was very pious, truly, so I may not doubt, but her piety was too obtrusive, too much in the style we heard a Negro call talky religion. Mr. Wilderton, very gently and kindly, that she might not be again so preposterous, pointed out to her the little mistake into which her deficiency in geographical science had led her when she fervently thanked God her knowledge was not of this world. Assuredly it is not. Another young lady thought a country without a king or queen must be so dull. All princes are so witty that dullness is unknown within their circle, and when she found America had not always been a republic, she asked who got the crown jewels the kings must have had in those old times. Even intelligent persons in England appeared to believe that a system of harshness, rapacity, and injustice is pursued toward the aboriginal Indians by the authorities and the people of the United States. The contrary I believe to be the case. Few here appear to know that the amount paid annually by our government to each Indian within the territories of the Republic is greater than the average amount of all taxes paid to the state by a subject of Prussia. That is, each Indian receives more from our government than each Prussian pays to his. This appears from an estimate prepared from official reports for a Prussian periodical. Another thing appears clear enough to me, that the English do not like to be undeceived in their erroneous estimate of American wrongdoings. The main boundary question. Their boundaries are the same. One old lady who is prouder of her horses than of her wealth, her high birth, her fair daughters, or her jewels. Indeed, her horses, matchless though well matched, are the immediate jewels of her soul, expressed to me great satisfaction that the boundary question was settled at last, for it must have been so unpleasant when travelling to find your coachman trespassing on a wrong or disputed road, and having to turn back, perhaps so trying to the horses. The good lady would find it trying enough to her horses were they on the frontiers of Maine. Many of the English are so apt to look upon this boundary dispute as upon a debatable line. Debatable enough it has been, to be sure, between two of their own counties or parishes. They are so generally a people who travel not out of themselves, and judge all matters by their preconceived notions of familiar things. If the territory west of the Rocky Mountains be mentioned, they seem to have a vague notion of a transatlantic Wales. Not that the many oracles of this uninformed, unlettered class will scruple judgment upon American questions. Far from it. They will even declare they can prove their opinions upon Yankee topics to be correct. This is rather like what the engravers call a proof before letters. One can no more help noticing it, ignorance, than a person bent on a pleasant pedestrian excursion can avoid being watchful of the weather. A lady once expressed to me her commiseration that I was returning to a city so pestered with, what think you, rats? No, mosquitoes, no, alligators. Love, the scandalmonger man, accuses English ladies of being inveterate husband hunters, but the same is commonly said of the ladies of other countries, though the unique gallantry of the French forms an honourable exception. In my opinion, any young lady here, no matter how plain, may readily win an English husband, if she can and will adroitly and continuously flatter his self-love. He cannot resist such evidence of sound judgment, acute observation, and power of discourse. He lends his pleased ear, and then offers his most precious self. I can hardly conceive a true wealthy Englishman in love, that is, honestly, disinterestedly, and passionately. An Englishman in love was a monumental statue ever in a fever. Condition of women. In no country in the world so wretchedly as in England can a young woman, reared so as to be unfitted for domestic service, support herself safely or honourably. If she have not accomplishments, many and showy enough to obtain her the situation of governess, I do not know what she can do to earn bread and water. The English profess to regret this, and selon leur règle, see no means of altering it, and so pronounce it impossible. They make not a single effort to amend the matter, and cry impossible, impossible. An Englishman would pronounce it impossible to relieve his starving foster mother as he was on his way to purchase a pipe of port of some curious vintage to be bottled for the revelry of after years. Impossible. How is it known to be impossible? Gas lights and steam vessels were at first pronounced impossible. Nay, the establishment of Christianity itself was declared impossible by the misbelievers, the evildoers, the credulous, in many gods and goddesses of old. Impossible. How English adjectives are misused. Love of money. I cannot conceive how a man of Mr. Dickens' acuteness could be led to think as from the spirit rather than the letter of his work. One must conclude he does think that Mammon is as much a god in America as in Britain. The golden calf they worship at Boston, says he, is a pygmy compared with the giant effigy set up in other parts of that vast counting-house which lies beyond the Atlantic. He might have added, and less than a babe pygmy compared with that before which London bows the knee. Bows the knee. It is far more than that. It is a prostration of the entire man. Mammon is the love of the English, and to his worship in this his capital Campbell's lines may be truly applied. Here is the empire of his perfect bliss, and here he is a god indeed divine. The mere possession of unusual and useless money calls forth the adoration of the Englishman. I am grieved to add too often of the Englishwoman. Even very young ladies will prefer a rich husband, be he fool or braggart, to an amiable and intelligent one with little more than a competency. How often have I heard it said, Miss So is a fortunate girl. She's going to be married to Mr. So, and he is very rich while her fortune is a small one. Yes, but is he not a passionate, quarrelsome sot, and more than twice her age? All that may be, but then £30,000. There is nothing more to be said. Egotism. You think if the English knew the strictures passed upon them by foreigners, by quick-witted Frenchmen especially, they would be surprised and hurt. Not a jot, not a jot. They would attribute all blame to envy or malice, all praise they would consider becoming but faint, and let a general character of an Englishman be never so true, not one would cry, that was levelled at me. They smart at satire. They amend because of friendly rebuke. How little do you know what self-conceit really is. Many of their own countrymen, poets, or preachers tell them of their faults full freely, and not one becomes less a thing of narrowness or assumption of self. The way in which children spell the first personal pronoun is the very motto of a southern Briton. I by itself, I. Generosity of feeling. The English laugh at the Americans for being sensitive to satire, or as it is sometimes elegantly worded, so thin-skinned. And if it were so, does it not show a kindly filial love of country, unknown to the phlegmatic Englishman? A generous people would respect rather than wish to irritate the patriot's feeling, which felt wounded when scornful jeer misprized the land he loved so dear. But the nationality of the Americans, the Spaniards, and the Scotch are alike censured by a people who care too much for themselves individually to care for their country or their kind. It is a Scottish man and a poet who asks, breathes there a man with soul so dead, who never to himself has said, this is my own, my native land? How the London people who have read the lay must have smiled at the simplicity of the minstrel. Conceit. Truly one ought to have a temper as imperturbable as Franklin's to hear patiently the absurd remarks the British make upon the United States. I could not have believed such ignorance existed. It must be that well-informed men are generally less common in this country than at home. Here are hundreds of thousands with ample means and leisure whose reading is confined to the newspapers. But let me correct the broad assertion I ought to have said to certain portions of certain newspapers. Yet one of this class will deliver his judgment upon America in a manner which shows he considers that what he says is decisive. There is or should be no appeal. He has spoken. Self-conceit is more meat and drink to these Englishmen than to see a clown was to Touchstone. They have a vague notion about America and Indians and General Washington, and there being neither king nor lords, and the storming of Quebec and the burning of the Caroline and the loss of the president. But as to the vast resources of our country, the nature of her laws and institutions, of her cities rising amid primeval forests, of the capabilities of her rivers and bays, of the love of freedom in her children, which love, men say, is the parent of all the best virtues that can adorn a state, of these things they know nothing. Talk to one of these persons about the cotton grown in the southern states, and he will immediately speak of Manchester, where he has a cousin worth £100,000, not dollars, mind, manufacturer driving a roaring trade, roaring enough if the clatter of 1,000 wheels can effect it. Mention one of those matchless prairies in the far west, a noble sight, though Boz was disappointed, and my gentleman, as soon as he is made to understand what a prairie is, turns the conversation to Salisbury Plain or the moors of Scotland. Rank Robespierre described himself as l'esclave de la liberté, and I know one American at least whom the designation suits. The Frenchman should have said le tyran, not l'esclave. Your thriving Englishman is the slave to aristocratic distinctions, and sometimes at these charity dinners he is nodded to by his grace, perhaps my lord, condescends to take wine with him, and he at once sees the excellence of having a class privilege because rocked in coroneted cradles, and learns to despise the simplicity of a republic. I believe, however, that the real aristocracy in their select circles amuse themselves no little at the expense of these bourgeois gentilshommes, as supple where rank is concerned, if not as simple as Monsieur Giordano, when that worthy worshipper of the great believed that he was marrying his daughter to the son of the Grand Turk. Amiability. The English rarely open their mouths for any purpose but to eat and drink while they travel. I found this the case, not only in this short trip, but in my journey to the north and elsewhere. They are as fond of taciturnity as the Americans are of tobacco, and for my single self I cannot see the good of either. Many an American will sit chewing the cud of sweet and bitter fancy with his weed, but he never forgets the attentions due to the other sex, while an Englishman sits wrapped in dismal thinkings, forgetful or neglectful of everything but himself, and with each breath he draws he seems to inhale gloom thrice distilled. But he dispenses with the potent weed. I care not to dwell upon this subject, but it really appears that the main discovery which clever men have crossed the Atlantic to make, and which ladies have carefully recorded in their diaries, is that the Americans, I must use the vernacular, spit. Were I asked a national characteristic of the Englishman, I should say they sulk. I'm told the English mean more good intentions, more masses of pavement, to testify as respectful a regard as the Americans. If it be so, certainly their way of doing it is full of oddness and originality. Better the Yankee inquisitiveness, of which travellers complain, than utter and contemptuous silence. Better an embodied inquiry and an animated note of interrogation, with a twist in the mind, than the surly masculine selfishness I have so often met with here. I am inclined to think Englishmen consider their repulsiveness a becoming and even national attribute, a sort of birthright. Esau's example has not been followed. This personal property is rarely disposed of, but is handed down intact from father to son. The English appear to regard the petits soins, the attention ladies are taught to expect in society, as a tax upon their time and speech, and like a tax they pay it, that is, grudgingly or not at all if they can help it. When do you see gratuitous politeness extended to age? When to poverty? End of section 9. End of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 22, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.